If ever a house had cracks and fissures running through and through, my apartment in Brooklyn did. The walls were chipping away with pain, misunderstanding, frustration, and agony. Agony kept returning even after the bathrooms had been scrubbed of their grime, the freezer defrosted of its ice, the carpets vacuumed of their dirt. You see, there were 8 of us living in the 2 apartments on the 3rd floor of the 6-family building. My mother, her boyfriend, and for the purposes of this discussion, let's call him Mud. So there was my mother, there was Mud, there were my 2 younger sisters and 2 younger brothers and myself. With more money in her hands, my mother had enough of Mud and his ways. The family next door to apartment 3R moved and my mother seized the day, moving me and my sister in, along with herself and my grandmother. My grandmother and my aunt had a fallen out and my mother offered her shelter. My mother had to now shuffle between apartments 3R and 3F, making meals and cleaning on the weekends. She may have been doing a bit more running, but I think she was happy to have reclaimed part of her independence and gotten her kids from under a horrible, horrible situation. In apartment 3R, where Mud ruled, he craved power, and when we were spread out over the 2 apartments, he had to work that much harder to achieve dominance. I studied his scheming and his treachery. He was a master spin doctor who operated on my grandmother with Machiavellian precision. And they always seemed to do their preaching when my mother wasn't around. Oftentimes, especially in the summer, my mother would go away with the family she worked with. She was a nanny, and they would go to the Hamptons for a week and she would be gone, and so the only adult presence in the house was Mud and my grandmother. And they were always in cahoots. He always worked her over, and she had no clue what was going on. Mud would get together with my grandmother and they'd talk about the troubles in the house. The 2 were believers in the Caribbean version of family values, which is pseudo-male dominance and unquestioned respect for elders. They formed an enemy faction against my mother and my sister. To them, my teenage sister should have been making meals or cleaning up after people and basically getting used to that submissive female role. But my sister grew up in this country. She enjoyed going outside, skipping double dutch in the schoolyard across the street with her friends. She couldn't be blamed. In my mother, my sister saw a strong, independent woman who did what she had to preserve her sense of self. My sister was being what she saw around her. All 3 generations of women in the apartment were just being what they were. My grandmother was old school, stuck in her ways. My mother had been a survivor and could adapt. And my sister, well, she was being a teenage girl testing boundaries. And if only the women could see the situation from the outside like I did, a lot of the problems could have been avoided. My grandmother questioned the way my mother was rearing my sister. Of course, my mother never went for that. She'd done this all on her own on the island without my grandmother and her sisters and her brothers. But she knew the reality for a girl in New York City. My sister had to grow a backbone. My grandmother and Mud didn't have a clue about what it was like to be a young American woman growing up in New York City. They had come of age on an island isolated with its own value system and structure. And when my mother was not around, the 2 of them would reinforce their positions by tearing my sister and mother down. But I stayed out of it. I said good morning and good evening to my grandmother. I was cordial and nice and did whatever she wanted. I couldn't blame her. She was being worked over by a Machiavellian prince, Prince of Darkness. There was a certain force in the house. I didn't think it was evil, but I knew it wasn't good. I would leave for school each morning wondering if there'd be blood on the walls when I returned. I made it through school and friends and playing and such with my fear in check. I mean, some would say I was mature, that I was able to handle circumstance and move on. I don't know about that. My sister, she was not mature. She lashed out. She fought. She got in trouble. She missed school. She did everything a child would do when they cannot deal with the situation they were in. I was scared that my sister would do something grievous like kill herself, but I'm very thankful that she didn't. All these machinations were going on in the house. Mud had solid control of 3R, and my 3 younger siblings, his biological kids, were with him. My grandmother tried to influence the apartment that my mother and myself and my sister stayed in, and I still held a grudge against her. My mother cared about keeping the peace, so she listened to her mother's side, her kid's side, and her man's side of every little thing that went wrong. She had to be going nuts. I started seeing this because the same thing was happening in my adolescence. You see, the more information I was starting to process about the way the world worked, the way I worked, the way me and the world were supposed to work, and the problems that existed in all that working and machination, the crazier life seemed. And all my mother wanted to do was relax. Instead, she had to run back and forth mending fences between apartments that always broke again. I don't think she ever figured out all that was happening while she was away changing diapers, reading stories, or otherwise being a surrogate mother to two white girls that treated her more like a mother than her own kids. I was becoming a firm believer in rational thinking. There were lines of reasoning that worked. I needed life to work. Book learning was what I knew. To best learn, a person needs all the information available. What was happening in our apartments wasn't rational. My mother didn't have all the information. She was fighting battles with half a tank. When she hit my sister for something that my grandmother complained about, she was trying to discipline while being an obedient daughter to her own mother. And when she and my sister were laughing 2 hours later, she was trying to understand while reaching out to her daughter. It was absolute confusion, and how could I not begin to sympathize with my mother, especially since the same confusion was happening inside of me? My mother looked so pleased the night I walked into apartment 3F for the first time. Mud had just finished installing the carpet in my new room. See, that moment, knowing that my mother wanted me to smile, knowing she knew how happy I was to have my own space, escape into, to get away to, knowing my smile would mean the world to her, knowing that I wanted to give her the world with my smile, I refused to. I bottled up my happiness and stood in the middle of the room, indifferent. The minute I let my emotions go, I'm a goner, I thought.
How will you know unless you try?
The more I show I care about her, the more she can control me.
You still believe that thing?
Even with all going on in my head, life was getting better. I had a new room for a new phase in my life, so mumbling a thank you to Mud, a very unnerving, almost sickening thing to do. Imagine looking at the devil and having to thank him for carpeting your room that you want to get into.
He must never think he taught me anything or did anything to benefit my life in any way. I had nothing to say to that man.
Everybody wants to be acknowledged for who they are. They want to be talked to, interacted with. Their humanity is reaffirmed with every word. You are talking to them. They are answering you. The process reminds them that they are alive. By remaining silent, I was killing Mud. He couldn't fight me with words. He couldn't put me in my place. I was killing his version of what it meant to be a man. It brought me great joy to bring him some form of pain. He wasn't a man. How could the man push my mother in front of me and expect me to respect him? How weak was the bastard? I had a bookload of insecurities about being a man, but I didn't take them out on anyone, at least not physically. I admit to playing mind games on the folks in the house by withdrawing my true self. I was hurting my mother more than any of Mud's physical attacks, but at least I didn't hit her. I mean, for what I saw, my mother did her fair share of instigating the arguments and the fights. She had her own issues too, but he had the strength to cool down. He should have stood back and let her rant for a little bit. I mean, she would calm down, she always did. My mother was 5'3", she wasn't gonna do him any damage. She was giving up close to a foot in height. I mean, really, what was she gonna do? But no, the man wanted to be the man of the house. And no wonder my mother moved out. I sat down in my room that first night and thought about everything that was happening and tried to make sense of it. A new phase of my life was starting. It was 1990, the beginning of a new decade. I was on the 38th parallel. To the south was all the baggage I was carrying. I hated, I masked my hate. I began to hate my mask. To the north, I saw logic. It was simple, universal, and overpowering.
You have to forgive and move on.
I heard that everywhere. Logic overtook me with the force of the November Revolution. Human instinct started to pop up. I had two brothers. I had to nurture them. I knew exactly where they could end up, and I didn't want them to feel the way I did when they were my age. I had two sisters. I had to protect and love them. I had to show them what a good man was. Things couldn't go on the way they were. I had to grow up. I had to become a 90s man, intelligent, forceful, yet willing to change. The Cold War was over. The wall came down. I had a job to do on the home front. I would never grow if I didn't do it. I would never be the man I wanted to be if I didn't do it.
Right here, right now, what you